Good morning, folks. This is your peach update for those of you that are not a frozen peach and those of you who are not Chuck Shithead Schumer. Chuckie, does Sisyphus ring a bell? Good God, man. I finally gave up watching when I heard the same goddamn thing time and time again, and every single one of them got tabled on a party line basis. Big shock, right? We now have a operative resolution that governs the process, whether Schumer likes it or not. Chuck continued to refuse to bundle all of his requests into one motion, thereby ensuring that the Senate would not actually adjourn until well past the hour of midnight. In fact, I think it was about 2 o'clock in the morning before they finally got the hell out of there. And frankly, it was just completely stupid because all he was really doing, let's face facts. After he lost the first resolution and it got tabled, he knew he was going to lose the rest of them. So the only reason to bring them up is to allow Adam Shithead, along with the other so-called managers, to sit there and hammer the Senate chamber for hours with the same arguments. And the point is that this is not productive because you're not going to convince, not only you're not going to convince anybody doing this, you're likely to shift votes the wrong direction because all you're doing is pissing people off. And that's not what you want to do, right? Supposedly. Well, maybe it is what they wanted. I don't know what these people are actually thinking, but I'll tell you what they're not thinking. They're not using their fucking heads. There is absolutely no logic behind the path that the Democrats took yesterday in the Senate chamber. It's stupid. It's stupid beyond words. And I do not understand the logic that these people have in trying to pursue things this way. It just... Look, the last thing you want to do is, nail boards over people's minds and ears. And that's exactly what you do when you badger the living shit out of them like this by saying the same thing over and over and over and over again. You do not convince anybody by doing that, ever. Come on, man. Have you ever had a fight with your spouse or one of your kids where they just, the argument doesn't change? It's the same thing, and they keep going, you made a decision, they don't like it. Rather than try to convince you with some kind of new set of facts or some new argument, they just keep pounding at you with the same argument that they used before and failed. And all that happens is you have more no come out of your mouth. That's all they're going to get. So it's stupid beyond words what we saw yesterday. It was a spectacle. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know who he was playing to, because if he's trying to play to the American public with this, do you think any of them are watching C-SPAN at 2 o'clock in the morning? He's certainly not playing to the Senate, because the senators are not going to pay any attention. Who's his audience? I don't get it. All right, I just truly don't get it. But this is Chuckie. This is Chuckie. Okay. All right, there you go. So there we are. And there it is. And, all that. Okay. So let's go back to the crux of the matter and the reality of it, which is that now we have an operating resolution to actually hear this. We've got 3 days that are going to be split up instead of 2. That's fine. We have 18 hours essentially of both argument and rebuttal on the opening statements for both sides, the impeachment managers, and then the president's side with Ciprian and his pals. And so we're going to get that. And then at that point, then we will see where we go from there. Now, the other thing, and again, this mirrors Clinton's impeachment, is that if there is a vote to hear witnesses, they will have to be deposed first by the Senate. So first we take depositions, and then only after we've taken depositions do we hear testimony. And unlike the House, there is none of this bullshit about depositions that are taken in a skiff and never get released to anybody else, including the other side. We never have the situation arise where one side gets to selectively leak this stuff and use it, and the other side can't respond. That's not going to happen here because of the way the organizing resolution is set up. And of course, the other side of it is that there's nobody on the Republican side that's going to want to see that happen, because that's that doesn't work to their advantage. If you remember, during Clinton's impeachment, there were a couple depositions taken, but there was no public testimony. And the reason was that the public testimony had been heard previously, and the Democrats are screaming with their hair on fire, saying, "Well, but in this case, there were people who did it." Yes, and the reason that they didn't testify and that the matter wasn't disposed was that instead of going through the courts, instead of doing that, they turned around and filed the articles. That was not the Republicans' decision. It was the Democrats' decision. You cannot take a decision like this and then turn around and say, "Oh, it's the other guy's fault because he asserted executive privilege." Executive privilege is a real thing. I don't care whether the Democrats like it or not. By the way, Eric Holder, who was held in contempt of Congress after his particular situation, did go through the courts, and he gave him the finger anyway. Fast and Furious, anybody? And oh, by the way, this wasn't just a little money flying around. There was actually a dead border agent as a result of Eric Holder's bullshit. Everybody forgets that. Well, I don't. So what do we got? Nothing new. And but I will say this. I'm very much looking forward to how this all plays out. Okay, next things up. God, nobody wants to talk about the Fed repo thing, and the Fed's tilting at windmills now with over $100 billion that was thrown out into the market in the last few days. Gee, I wonder why it keeps going up. Oh, no, that's not QE. Even Larry Kudlow, who is normally one of those people who oh, no, he toes the party line. He broke with it yesterday. Now, that's interesting because at some point, if the market discerns that the Fed is taking an emergency measure, remember, QE is an emergency measure, in the time when supposedly everything is so wonderful and peachy, they're going to start asking a lot of questions. And those questions are not going to come in a form you're going to like. They're going to come in the form of sell orders. So, is that imminent? I don't think so, but I think you should keep your nose to the ground on it because it could very easily happen. Other thing that's interesting is oil is way down. That is probably a function of a couple of other things that are going on, like, for example, coronavirus. You think? I would think. Another interesting thing, which to me is fascinating, is that natural gas is way down. Okay, and what I think is very interesting about natural gas being down so much in the current context is that when you look at the price of natural gas, it's falling like a stone, and yet these last few days we've had extraordinarily cold weather. Apparently hasn't turned into heating degree days and natural gas demand. You'd think it would, but apparently it has not. And then, of course, it's supposed to warm up and get milder here within the next few days. We'll see whether or not that actually happens. I hope it does, because, boy, I'll tell you what, baby, it's cold outside, in a rather dramatic and serious fashion, I think. So, incidentally, interesting thing, the new house has a heat pump in it. And, of course, heat pumps have electric-resistant strip heating built into them that can be either triggered on manually through stage 2, if you have a 2-stage thermostat, or in the case of an older style thermostat, there's a little button marked emergency heat. You turn that thing on, the electric strips come on inside the air handler, and God forbid, you are not going to like what happens to your power bill. Okay. For the first time last night, I actually now know where the cold tolerance temperature is, where the compressor cannot keep up. The house has available gas service. It's there. It's in the building. And, in fact, there's a stub sitting right next to the air handler. So I think a little HVAC revamp might be due, because I'm quite sure that burning natural gas for auxiliary heat, if it becomes necessary, is going to be a hell of a lot cheaper than running a strip heater. Of course, on the other hand, if it's only a couple nights a year, I'm not entirely sure I care so much. We'll see. It's it's kind of an interesting thing because, the newer design heat pumps are much more efficient at extracting heat. Normally, the logic is that when you get down to around freezing, a little above freezing, 35, 40 degrees, 35-ish, that heat pumps become ineffective on a cost basis. Apparently, that's not true anymore because this one was easily able to keep up with temperatures in the upper 20s without any problem at all. So I think that's kind of an interesting little aside. But anybody that has one of these things, the last thing you want is those heat strips to come on. Good God. You want to talk about your electric meter spinning. That'll do it. Okay. Back to Peachy and other related things. Final point related to the cold and the weather is this virus, this coronavirus. Current information is that it is more serious in terms of mortality rate than the common flu that goes around every year. It is approximately a little bit less serious so far than SARS, which of course was essentially a Chinese phenomenon. It never really got in the United States. In the same family as SARS, though, which is certainly something to pay attention to, and the fact that it's there at that level is to me a rather interesting thing. So I think this definitely deserves attention. But if it gets into the United States, and it appears it already has, and starts to spread, there could be real trouble. This is something that we ought to be thinking about very carefully, folks. As a nation, we have two very large, relatively porous borders. We have one that is not generally violated on a routine basis. That's with Canada. And then we have another one that is, which is Mexico. And that second one is a serious problem because even among regular, non trying to jump the fence kinds of people, we have a huge number of people who travel between those two countries on a regular basis. If we start to see problems with that disease, or for that matter in the future, we have a communicable disease, the willingness and ability to slam the door closed on this becomes a very serious problem, and the ability to screen people at that border is essentially impossible given the flow. We probably can screen the border, the Canadian border, but again, it would be an extraordinarily serious thing to do because of the level of ordinary commerce that goes on. And this is something that we have not put a lot of thought into as a nation, but we really ought to. It is probably the case in the world of air travel, and given the latency of infectious disease in the general case, that it is inevitable that if you have something that's bad that gets going in one country, that it's going to spread and it's going to get outside of that set of borders. And once it does, there's not a lot you can do because the person who is infectious but not showing symptoms gets on an airplane, flies into your country, and they don't know they're sick. Okay, so this is not about willful evasion. It is also not able to be screened for effectively because you can't, for example, detect a fever in somebody who isn't yet symptomatic. And yet they are shedding virus particles, and therefore they're contagiously able to pass it to other people. I don't know that we have a way to stop that. But we should be thinking very carefully as a country about this, not just from a standpoint of natural mutations, which incidentally go on all the time, but also the possibility of weaponization of these kinds of things. Let me point out to everybody who's listening today that this is not just a theoretical exercise. This has happened in the past. We have had in human history terrible diseases on an epidemic basis that have swept through the globe and have killed very significant percentages of the population. We now claim that we are so wonderful because we have modern medicine and antibiotics and all this and that and the other thing. But it will happen again. We haven't had it happen in a significantly long period of time, but it has happened in the past and it will happen again. And when it does, we ought to have some kind of a plan to deal with it other than just say, well, 10% of our population is going to croak or whatever the number is. You got to realize something, folks. we do not have the medical facilities to treat substantial percentages of the American population, neither does anyone else, in an inpatient facility, i.e. a hospital, at any given point in time. Something like this that happens, if it gets loose into the United States and really does take off, is going to completely destroy the infrastructure in terms of available beds within our medical facilities. The only sane option you will have is to try to ride it out at home. And that's not to say you'll succeed, because you might not. You might die. But you have a 0% chance of being able to get treatment somewhere else and actually be successful, because there is no way you're going to be able to actually pull that off. It's just not going to happen. So this is something to think about, folks. We are not prepared for this, okay, in any way, shape, or form. As a nation, as a world, we're not prepared for this. And yet, there isn't, you can't put in place infrastructure that would truly be preparatory for it. All right, I know that people like to talk about, well, we should find a way to have infrastructure that's sufficient for that. There isn't any way to do that, ladies and gentlemen. You need to understand that there just isn't. We couldn't build enough hospital beds in order to accommodate that, and if we did, they'd be empty 99% of the time, which is stupid. So just give some thought to this. The self-quarantine, if something like this actually gets going, your best option is going to literally be to sit in your house and do not leave. Nobody leaves. You don't let anyone in. You don't let anybody out. Because as long as all of you that are currently in the residence are not ill, and you don't let anyone in the residence who is ill, and nobody goes out that is not ill, then you're not going to get infected. And you just have, but you may end up having to sit it out for a month or more, literally self-quarantined in your own place. That doesn't, boy, you got to think about that, folks. Because, that's the kind of disaster. Right? How many people prepare for that? That are actually prepared to be able and willing to self-quarantine their own house for that length of time with no in or out? Well, it's something that you ought to consider, because it's a very real possibility. I'm your ticker guy, and that's how it is.